They thought they could push me around, turns out they picked the wrong fight. The HOA tried to take control of my family's land. But one heated meeting exposed their greedy plans, and it cost them their power. This is the story they didn't want you to know. It started like any other morning, quiet and serene. My 500-acre Timberland had always been a peaceful, isolated refuge for me, away from the noise of city life and the constraints of urban living. This land, inherited from my grandfather, held a sense of legacy and pride that went beyond its trees, its natural beauty, and its vast expanses. It was my sanctuary, the place where I could reconnect with nature and focus on the things that mattered most to me. But that tranquility was about to be shattered, and I had no idea just how deep the consequences would go. I had never been one to interact much with the local homeowners association. HOA. I wasn't part of their neighborhood. My land, while near the town, was far enough removed that it didn't fall under the HOA's direct jurisdiction. I didn't subscribe to their rules, their meetings, or their way of doing things. To be honest, I had never even attended a meeting. I had no reason to, nor did I want to. But one fateful day, I received an official letter in the mail that I knew would change everything. The letter was thick, formal, and smelled faintly of bureaucracy. It was a demand, not a polite request, from the HOA board, instructing me to attend their next meeting. The language was firm and controlling, something that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. It wasn't just an invitation, it was an order. The letter stated that my land had been flagged for non-compliance with several community rules that supposedly applied to properties in the area. I was baffled. There was no way my private Timberland, which had never been part of their domain, was now under their control. What did they want from me? Why now, after all these years of peaceful ownership? And why was it coming from people who had no business even being involved in my land management? The letter didn't provide much detail, except to say that it was important for me to be present at the HOA meeting, where my property would be discussed, and that failure to comply could result in fines or even legal action. I was confused and irritated. The audacity of the HOA to interfere with my private property rights was mind-boggling. My first instinct was to ignore the letter. I didn't owe them anything. But something about the tone of the letter made me reconsider. It was as if they were trying to bully me into submission, expecting me to fold without even questioning their authority. I wasn't going to let that happen. So, I did the one thing I wasn't expecting to do. I decided to show up. The day of the meeting arrived, and as I pulled into the HOA's building, a small, unassuming office tucked away behind a local strip mall, I could already feel the tension building in my chest. The parking lot was filled with luxury SUVs and high-end sedans, the cars of people who probably had no idea what real work looked like. These were the people who seemed to have nothing better to do than police other people's property, trying to impose their vision of what the world should look like. As I walked into the building, I noticed a large conference room where the board members were gathered around a long table. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their faces a mix of smugness and superiority. I could already tell that they thought they had the upper hand. They probably expected me to cower in front of them, to apologize for my existence and agree to whatever terms they set. But I wasn't like that. I took my seat at the table, the room buzzing with a mix of excitement and anticipation. There were a few other members of the community present, probably people who had nothing better to do than watch this spectacle unfold. The board members began to speak in that condescending tone they reserved for people they considered beneath them, offering me a friendly reminder about how important it was to adhere to the HOA's guidelines, even though my land had never been under their purview. One of the board members, a man named Gregory, who was the HOA president, was the first to address me. He started with a feigned politeness, using words like concern and community values, as though trying to soften the blow of the reality that they were about to impose their will on my land. He mentioned that they had received complaints about my timber operation, particularly about the way I managed the forest and the trees I had been harvesting. They seemed to think that my land was somehow disturbing the community aesthetic. I had to bite my tongue at that. The idea that these people, who didn't even live near me, were telling me how to manage my land, was absurd. Gregory went on to explain that the HOA had rules about preserving the natural environment, including restrictions on clear-cutting trees, managing wildlife, and even the types of structures I could build on my property. Of course, they had never bothered to reach out to me before. But now, suddenly, they were concerned about how my land was being used. They said that the board was determined to protect the surrounding area, which they considered valuable real estate, from the perceived damage I might be causing. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. Who were these people to tell me how to care for my land? They had no idea what it took to manage a large property like mine, to tend to the trees and the wildlife, and to balance the need for responsible timber harvesting with environmental preservation. It was my responsibility, and it had been passed down through generations. My grandfather had built this land with his sweat and blood, and now these strangers were trying to take control of it. The conversation dragged on, with the board members offering a slew of irrelevant arguments. They claimed they had the community's best interests at heart. But it was becoming increasingly clear that they had a hidden agenda, one that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with their power. It wasn't about the trees. It wasn't about the environment. It was about control. They were trying to assert their dominance over me, over my property, over my rights, and they thought that because I was just a single landowner, I wouldn't have the strength or the resources to fight back. I listened to their speeches, their thinly veiled threats, and I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself now, it would only get worse. This wasn't just about my Timberland, it was about every landowner in the area who had been bullied into submission by the HOA. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. Not on my watch. The moment they finished their lecture, I stood up. There was no way I was going to sit there and let them continue their tirade. I knew that if I wanted to protect my land, I had to make it clear that I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't going to back down. I began to speak, slowly at first, gathering my thoughts, but soon the words came flowing out with the same confidence and clarity that I had been building up for years. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to make them see that I wasn't their target. I told them in no uncertain terms that I wasn't going to let them control my land. I wasn't going to let them impose their rules on something that was mine by right. I spoke about my grandfather's legacy, about the careful, responsible way I managed the timber and cared for the land. I told them that if they wanted to protect the community, they could start by minding their own business and respecting the rights of property owners like me. The room went silent. For a moment, no one spoke. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. I had caught them off guard. They didn't expect anyone to stand up to them, especially not someone like me, someone who didn't play by their rules. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. And that was just the beginning of a battle I had no idea would lead to the downfall of their control over the HOA. The meeting had barely begun, yet it was clear to everyone in that room that something was off. The board members sat at the long table with their arms crossed, exchanging glances, their eyes locked onto me as if they expected me to bow down, to surrender my rights. I wasn't just a landowner anymore. To them, I was an obstacle, a challenge to their power that they couldn't afford to let slide. The sense of entitlement they carried in their demeanor was palpable, as if my very existence was something they needed to control. They thought that because I was alone, one individual against an entire board, that I would fold under pressure. But that was far from what was going to happen. The moment Gregory, the HOA president, finished his speech, I felt the full weight of their gaze. It wasn't just about what they were saying, it was about the subtle, condescending undertones of their words. The unspoken message that I was simply a person who didn't belong in their carefully constructed world. As Gregory sat back in his chair, waiting for me to respond, I knew that I had one chance to prove to them that this would not be a walk in the park. I had to stand my ground. I looked around the room at the faces of the board members, their judgmental stares piercing through me. Some of them were older, their features hardened by years of experience. But it was the younger members, those who were new to the board. eager to make their mark that I found most infuriating. They looked at me like I was the villain in their carefully crafted story of community protection, and I was about to shatter that illusion. I couldn't believe the audacity of their assumptions. My Timberland was mine. It was my family's legacy, and it had always been a place of tranquility. I had carefully managed the land for years, striking the delicate balance between preservation and responsible harvesting. But apparently, my methods didn't fit into their neatly defined world of rules and regulations. To them, I wasn't a responsible landowner. I was someone who needed to be disciplined. Someone who didn't understand the importance of following orders. But that wasn't the truth. And I wasn't about to let them get away with their assumptions. I stood up from my chair, slowly but deliberately, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on me. It was a calculated move. By standing, I was signaling that I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't going to shrink into the background and let them push me around. The tension in the room was thick, and I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. But I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. If I backed down now, I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. Control. Gregory, the HOA president, shot me a look that mixed curiosity with thinly veiled disdain. He probably thought I was going to apologize, to admit that I had been wrong in some way. But that wasn't going to happen. I had spent too many years working on this land, too many hours learning the ins and outs of forestry, to be told by some strangers how to manage it. This was my land. I wasn't going to let them take that away. Let me make this clear, I said, my voice steady but firm. You may have your rules, but they don't apply to me. My land is not part of your community, and it never has been. I don't owe you an explanation about how I manage it, and I am not going to bow down to your demands. Gregory's eyes narrowed, and I could see the moment he realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. He was used to getting his way, used to people folding under pressure, and here I was, refusing to comply with his vision of what my land should be. But instead of backing down, he leaned forward, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was trying to reassert his dominance, but I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. You don't seem to understand, Gregory said, his voice dripping with condescension. The HOA has rules for a reason. We protect the integrity of this community, and that means making sure that properties around here follow certain guidelines. Your land might not be officially part of our jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean it's exempt from the standards we've set. If you continue to operate your Timberland in the way you have, you could be putting the whole area at risk. It's not just about you, it's about the people who live here. The words hung in the air, each one more infuriating than the last. He was painting a picture of me as a reckless landowner, someone who didn't care about the impact my actions had on the community. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. I wasn't some careless businessman, clearing trees without thinking about the consequences. I had worked hard to maintain the health of my land, carefully considering the long-term impact of every decision. The HOA had no right to label me as a threat to their precious community standards. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my cool. I've been managing this land for years. It's my responsibility, and I take it seriously. My grandfather was the one who laid the foundation for this land, and I've followed in his footsteps. We've always worked in harmony with nature, ensuring that we only take what the land can afford to give. This is not about being reckless or irresponsible, it's about maintaining a balance that will sustain the land for future generations. You, on the other hand, are more concerned about power and control than actually understanding the complexities of land management. Gregory opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I was on a roll now, my frustration fueling my words. I understand your desire for control, but what you don't understand is that my land is not yours to control. You don't live here. You don't work the land. You don't see the day-to-day struggles that come with maintaining something like this. You're remaking assumptions based on what you think is best for a place you don't even know. The room was silent now, everyone waiting to see how the board would respond. The younger members, who had been sitting quietly until then, exchanged nervous glances, They probably thought I would back down once they pulled out their so-called rules and regulations. But I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them dictate my life, my land, or my future. I don't care about your rules, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I will not let you control my land, and I will not be bullied into submission. If you want to waste your time trying to impose regulations on me, be my guest, but I'll fight you every step of the way. The board members were now looking at each other in disbelief. They hadn't expected such a strong resistance. In their world, people like me were supposed to fall in line with their demands. But I wasn't going to be one of those people. I wasn't going to let them take away the things that mattered most to me. Gregory, clearly flustered by my response, tried to regain control of the situation. You don't understand how important these guidelines are, he said, his voice shaky now. It asks for the greater good of the community. We can't have people like you causing problems. I didn't hesitate. If you want to talk about the greater good, then start by respecting the rights of the people who live here. Stop assuming you have the right to control everything. My land is my responsibility, and I will protect it. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned and speechless board. It was only the beginning of what would become a long and difficult battle. But in that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. I had stood up for what was mine, and I had made it clear that no one, not even the HOA, was going to take that away from me. The meeting had ended with a tense, charged atmosphere, but I knew it was far from over. As I walked out of the HOA office, the weight of the confrontation settled in, but I could also feel a sense of determination brewing inside me. The board members may have expected me to back down after our heated exchange, but they underestimated my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for my legacy. What had started as a simple conflict over property rights was quickly morphing into a deeper battle, a battle I hadn't fully understood yet, but one I was now intent on winning. I spent the following days reflecting on the meeting, replaying the conversation in my head. Something didn't sit right with me. Gregory's words, though full of polite authority, seemed to mask a deeper, more insidious agenda. He had spoken about the community and their desire to protect the surrounding area, but there was something hollow about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just concerned about my land's impact on their aesthetic vision. There was something else at play here. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's actions and their past dealings in the community. It didn't take long to uncover something that would completely change the way I saw the HOA and the lengths they were willing to go to in order to secure their control. One of the first things I discovered was the HOA's history of land grabs. They had been involved in several high-profile disputes over the years, always under the guise of community protection or environmental preservation. But what I found was that many of the properties they had targeted had been prime real estate, and not for the reasons they had claimed. They were interested in acquiring land that could be developed for commercial purposes, land that could be subdivided and sold for profit. It became clear to me that their concern for the environment was not as genuine as they had made it out to be. The more I dug, the more I realized that their interest in my Timberland had less to do with trees and wildlife and everything to do with profit. I decided to take a closer look at the members of the board. It wasn't hard to find out that several of them had significant ties to local real estate development companies. The connections were all too clear to ignore. Gregory, the president, had recently been involved in negotiations with a major developer who was looking to build a sprawling residential complex on land nearby. The developer, of course, needed access to more land to make their plans viable, and it seemed that the HOA was more than willing to help. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that my Timberland was sitting on valuable land that could be easily developed. The HOA wasn't just concerned about my timber operation. They were trying to get their hands on my property to turn it into something much more profitable. At first, I thought this was just speculation after all. I didn't have concrete proof of their intentions. But then I uncovered something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a meeting, recorded and released to the public. where members of the HOA discussed the potential for land acquisition in the area. The discussion was casual, almost jovial, as they talked about how they could secure certain parcels of land for the benefit of the community, all while keeping up appearances of being protectors of the neighborhood. What they didn't know was that I had a copy of that meeting, and I was listening closely. The developers were mentioned by name, so were key pieces of land that were ripe for development, including mine. It was all coming together. The HOA wasn't trying to protect the land or maintain some kind of environmental standard. They were trying to increase their influence and control over the area. They were looking to profit from real estate deals under the guise of community oversight. They had identified my Timberland as a prime target, and they were willing to go to any lengths to acquire it. It wasn't just about me being a bad neighbor with my land management practices. No, they were trying to seize control of my property. And the rules they were so eager to enforce were just a convenient excuse to justify their actions. The realization hit me hard. I had been under the impression that I was simply dealing with a group of bureaucrats who didn't like the way I managed my land. I had assumed that they were acting out of ignorance or misunderstanding. But no, this was far more calculated. The HOA wasn't just a passive organization that was concerned with community standards. They were an active player in a much larger game, one that involved land development and corporate interests. They were leveraging their power to manipulate the community and enrich themselves at the expense of hardworking landowners like me. I knew then that I had to take action. This wasn't just a legal battle over property rights, it was a battle against a corrupt system that sought to undermine the very concept of private ownership for profit. They weren't just targeting me. They were targeting anyone who owned land they considered valuable. It was clear that if I didn't stand up for myself, I would be just another casualty of their greed. But standing up for myself wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, and they had connections in the local government, in real estate, and even in the media. They could twist the narrative however they wanted. They had been doing it for years, and they had the resources to bury anyone who dared to challenge them. The more I thought about it, the more daunting the task seemed. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me. You may be just one person, but one person can make a difference. It was a lesson I had carried with me through every difficult moment in my life. And now it was time to put it into practice. I knew I had to be strategic. This wasn't a fight I could win with emotion alone. I had to gather evidence, to build a case that would expose the HOA's true motives. So, I started reaching out to other landowners in the area. Some of them had already been dealing with the HOA's overreach, but they were hesitant to speak out for fear of retaliation. I assured them that I wasn't going to back down, and if we worked together, we might have a chance to bring the HOA's corrupt practices to light. I also enlisted the help of a lawyer, someone who specialized in property rights and land disputes. It wasn't just about the legal side of things, it was about understanding the intricacies of land ownership and zoning laws. Together, we began to compile a dossier on the HOA, gathering information about their past actions, their ties to developers, and the ways they had manipulated the system to their advantage. It was painstaking work, but it was necessary. I needed to be ready for the inevitable legal battle that would come. As the weeks went by, I began to uncover more damning evidence of the HOA's true intentions. I found records of secret meetings, where developers had been involved in discussions about land acquisition in the area. I found emails between board members and real estate moguls, all talking about the potential of certain properties, including mine. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no simple dispute over land use. This was about power, money, and control. I knew I couldn't do this alone, but together with the other landowners, the lawyer, and the information we had gathered, I was ready to take the fight to the next level. The HOA had underestimated me. They had thought they could bully me into submission, but they hadn't counted on me uncovering their hidden agenda. Now, the tables were turning. They had picked the wrong fight, and I was about to expose them for who they really were. The day of the public meeting arrived, and I could feel the weight of everything leading up to it pressing on my shoulders. The battle had been brewing for weeks, each passing day adding more fuel to the fire. The HOA, in their bid to control my land, had underestimated what they were up against. What they thought would be a simple meeting to intimidate me into submission was about to become the moment that exposed their true nature to the community and everyone who had been under their thumb for years. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up against an oppressive system that had long taken advantage of people who were too afraid or too uninformed to fight back. As I drove to the meeting, I couldn't help but replay everything that had happened up to this point in my mind. The discovery of the HOA's hidden agenda, the research into their corrupt dealings with developers, the meetings with my lawyer and other landowners, it all led to this moment. The room where this confrontation would take place was small, but it felt like a battleground. The building itself, while unassuming on the outside, was a fortress for the HOA's control. I had no illusions about what this meeting would be. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a showdown. They wanted to control my land. I wanted to protect my legacy. There was no middle ground. Walking into the meeting, I could already feel the tension hanging in the air. The room was packed with the usual faces, people who didn't have a stake in this fight, but who had always been willing to listen to the HOA's narrative. A few landowners who had been quietly suffering under the HOA's grip were also in attendance, their faces filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. They had seen what had happened to others in the past when they dared to speak out. I could tell they were all wondering the same thing. Would this be the moment when the HOA's power was finally broken? Or would they continue their unchecked reign? The board members were already seated at the long table, their faces smug and self-assured. Gregory, the president, was in the center, his posture straight, his fingers steepled in front of him as if he were some sort of master strategist. The others, his loyal followers, sat around him, looking at me like I was a nuisance they were about to deal with swiftly. Their arrogance was almost palpable. They believed that with all their power, they could easily control the room, as they always had in the past. They didn't know that I had come prepared, and I was ready to reveal the truth they had tried so hard to conceal. I stood at the front of the room, feeling every pair of eyes turn toward me. There was a hushed silence, the kind that comes before a storm. I could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what I was about to do. This wasn't just a dispute over property anymore. It wasn't just a disagreement about land use. This was about standing up to corruption, about calling out a system that had long abused its power. I was no longer fighting just for my land. I was fighting for every landowner who had been silenced, for every person who had ever been pushed around by the HOA's authority. The meeting began with Gregory standing up and giving his usual speech, filled with the same rhetoric about community values and protecting the neighborhood. It was the same empty talk they always used to justify their overreach. But today, it was different. Today, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to let them manipulate the community into thinking they were the heroes here. When Gregory finished his speech, I stood up, taking a deep breath before I spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. I've been asked to address the HOA's concerns regarding my land, and I will gladly do so. But before I do, I'd like to ask a simple question. Why is the HOA, an organization that is supposed to represent the interests of the community, suddenly so concerned with my private property? The room fell silent, and I could see Gregory's jaw tighten. He wasn't expecting this line of questioning. He thought I would come in meekly, ready to apologize. But I wasn't going to play by their rules. I've spent weeks uncovering the truth about this HOA and your intentions. I continued, my voice steady but firm. You claim that you are concerned about the environment, that you want to preserve the integrity of the community. But what you are really doing is manipulating the system for your own gain. You want control of my land because it is valuable land. You want to profit from its development. You've been in talks with real estate developers to acquire it. And that is the truth. This has never been about community preservation. It has always been about money. There was a collective gasp from the room. The board members were visibly rattled. But I didn't stop. I wasn't going to give them a chance to regain control of the narrative. I've done my homework. I know about your meetings with the developers. I have the emails, the records, the proof of your shady dealings. UV tried to frame this as a fight for community values. But it is really a fight for profit. You reusing your position to enrich yourselves and line your pockets. And at time the community knew the truth. Gregory stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is preposterous. You have no evidence to back up these claims. You're remaking wild accusations without any proof. His voice was shaky, but he was trying to hold onto his authority, trying to control the situation. He knew that if people started to believe what I was saying, his reign over the HOA would be over. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. I have everything I need to prove it, I said, holding up the papers for the room to see. Emails, records of meetings, development plans. I even have a recording of a conversation where you, Gregory, and the developers discuss my property as a potential acquisition. You can try to deny it, but the truth is right here. In black and white, the room erupted into chaos. People started murmuring, glancing at each other in disbelief. The HOA board members were scrambling now, trying to make sense of what was happening. They weren't used to being challenged in this way. They had always been able to control the narrative, to push people around with their power. But now, they were facing someone who wasn't afraid to expose them for who they really were. Gregory's face turned redder with each passing second as he tried to regain control. This is absurd. You're misinterpreting everything. This has nothing to do with profit. We're just trying to ensure that the community is protected. His words were becoming less coherent, more desperate, as he realized the noose was tightening around him. But I wasn't done yet. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is out now. You've been using your position to manipulate people, to push landowners into submission, all for your own gain. You're not protecting the community, you're exploiting it. The other board members sat in stunned silence, their usual arrogance replaced by fear. They knew that if the truth got out, their control over the HOA would be over. They had built their power on lies and manipulation, and now they were being exposed for what they truly were. The room was tense, the silence heavy with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. People were looking at the board members with a new understanding, their previous respect for them replaced with suspicion and distrust. It was clear that the HOA's grip on the community was slipping, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. As the meeting continued, the board tried to regain some semblance of control, but it was clear that they had lost the room. The members of the community were no longer interested in hearing their spin on things. They had seen the evidence, and they knew the truth. The HOA was no longer the powerful entity it had once been. The public showdown had exposed them for what they really were. A corrupt, self-serving organization more interested in profit than the welfare of the people it was supposed to serve. In the end, the meeting marked a turning point. The community was no longer under the sway of the HOA. The board's authority had been shattered, and their plans to take control of my land and possibly others were derailed. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but that meeting had set the stage for the fight to come. The tables had turned, and the HOA had finally met its match. The fallout from that fateful meeting came faster than I had anticipated. The public showdown had been the catalyst, but the ripples it caused were far-reaching. The moment I left the room, I knew the game had changed. The HOA, once an almost unchallenged entity in the community, had lost something far more important than just the legal fight. It had lost the trust and support of the people it was meant to represent. The community was waking up to the truth, and for the first time in years, the board members of the HOA were facing real consequences for their actions. But none of us could have predicted just how swiftly things would unravel. In the days following the meeting, the phone calls started to flood in. The local media, sensing a story too good to pass up, reached out for interviews. The neighbors who had been too scared to speak out before now felt emboldened, and they were eager to share their own experiences with the HOA. People who had quietly watched the board members exert their control over the neighborhood for years now wanted to join the fight. They knew something had changed. They knew that if they stood together, they could finally break the stranglehold the HOA had on the community. But it wasn't just the public support that began to shift. The board's internal dynamics started to crack. Gregory, the president of the HOA, was the first to feel the pressure. His carefully constructed facade of authority and control was crumbling. And with it, his reputation, the emails, the recordings, and the proof of his dealings with developers had spread like wildfire. And the more people learned about his hidden agenda, the more his position became untenable. The whispers of corruption grew louder. And it wasn't too long before the other board members began to distance themselves from him. Gregory, the once dominant figurehead of the HOA, began to show signs of strain. His usually confident posture turned to slouching, and his calm demeanor gave way to nervous fidgeting. He had spent years weaving a web of power, but now it was unraveling, and he had no idea how to stop it. He attempted to rally his fellow board members, trying to salvage whatever influence he had left. But the cracks had already formed, and the trust that had held the board together had eroded beyond repair. I knew that the next step was critical. The public had seen the truth, but now it was time to take action that would ensure the board members couldn't simply brush everything under the rug. The community needed to be mobilized, and we needed to show that this wasn't just a one-time victory, it was a movement. I met with a few of the other landowners and people who had supported me during the battle, and we began discussing our next steps. We knew that if we let the board regroup and regain their footing, they would try to push back in any way they could. The public's attention was on them now, but soon enough, the media would move on to the next big story, and the HOA would try to return to business as usual. The solution was clear. We needed to hold the board members accountable publicly and legally. With the support of several key community members, I started a petition to remove the current board members from their positions. The petition wasn't just about removing them from power. It was about sending a message. It was about showing the community that no one, not even the HOA, was above the law. We included every shred of evidence we had gathered, ensuring that the facts would speak for themselves. The more people saw the truth, the harder it would be for the board to make any sort of comeback. The petition spread quickly, gaining momentum with each passing day. People were angry not just about what had happened to me, but about the years of manipulation they had silently endured. The HOA had been operating under the assumption that their power was absolute, that they could make arbitrary decisions and push people around without consequence. But now, they were facing a united front of people who had had enough. I watched as the signatures poured in, as neighbors and fellow landowners came together to support the cause. The movement was gaining strength, and the board members had nowhere to hide. But it wasn't just the petition that was driving the board members into a corner. The local media had picked up the story, and the pressure was mounting. They began covering the HOA's corruption in detail, speaking to members of the community who had suffered under their oppressive rules. The interviews were compelling. Landowners spoke about how the HOA had harassed them, about how they had been bullied into compliance with rules that seemed to change at the board's whim. The media painted the picture of a greedy, power-hungry organization that was more concerned with their own financial interests than the well-being of the community they were supposed to serve. The board members, who had once been able to control the narrative, now found themselves on the defensive. They had never imagined their actions would come to light in such a public way. As the media coverage intensified, Gregory became more erratic. His once calm persona was now replaced by a man on the verge of cracking. He began to lash out at those who had once been his allies, accusing them of betraying him. His desperation was evident. He tried to hold emergency meetings with the other board members, but many of them were already starting to see the writing on the wall. Some of them had already begun to talk to the media, spilling details of the HOA's shady dealings in an attempt to salvage their own reputations. They knew that if they didn't distance themselves from Gregory, they would be dragged down with him. The trust had been broken, and the board was fractured. The tipping point came when one of the board members, a longtime ally of Gregory, made a public statement admitting that the HOA had been involved in illegal activities and had been working with developers to secure land for profit. The statement was a bombshell. It was everything we needed to finalize our case. No longer were we just fighting against accusations and hearsay. Now we had the confession we needed to push the board members out of power for good. By the time the petition was presented to the community, it had gathered overwhelming support. The board members, knowing that they had no way of recovering their positions, began to resign one by one. Gregory, the once proud president, was the first to go. His resignation was an admission of defeat, and it sent a clear message to the rest of the community. The HOA, in all its pomp and authority, had lost its grip. The power that had been so carefully cultivated for years was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The impact of their resignation rippled through the entire community. For years, the HOA had held everyone under its thumb, making decisions with little regard for the people they were supposed to represent. They had become a symbol of power and control, but now they were nothing more than a cautionary tale. Their downfall was a victory for the community, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could stay on top forever if they betrayed the people they were meant to serve. As the new board was elected, the community felt a sense of renewal. For the first time in years, the residents felt like they had a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The HOA no longer held the same sway over them. The power had shifted, and the people were in control. The new board was made up of community members who truly cared about the well-being of the area. They were determined to restore trust and ensure that the HOA would never again be used as a tool for exploitation. For me, the victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about personal gain. It was about the people who had suffered for far too long under the HOA's thumb. It was about standing up to a system that had been built on lies and corruption. We had won, not just for me, but for everyone who had been silenced. The HOA had lost its power, and in the process, we had reclaimed the community. The fight had been long and hard, but in the end, it was worth it. The victory was ours. Enjoying the story? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.